Good evening, everyone. I think we'll wait another 2 minutes and then we'll start. Okay. Sanjana, could you give me the co-host permission, please? I can't prevent my screen. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Okay. I want your answers and more importantly, I want the way that you found out the hypothesis. Yeah, Arya, you can start recording. Tell me. Give me your process of arriving at a hypothesis or rather a research question which can be made into a hypothesis for these idioms. We had discussed spare the rod and spoil the child. We had discussed the premise within it, which is this idea that physical punishment at in at crucial times is sometimes necessary for क्या बोलते हैं for creating docile creatures or agreeable children, right? Problematic. Now we'll talk about the ethics of it all in today's class. But tell me about absence makes the heart grow fonder. How do we actually go about testing something like this? If we want to actually prove this, absence does make the heart grow fonder. What are the ways in which we can go about finding? Is this really true? Okay, are people here? Am I audible? People did not do their homework. Okay. If you haven't done it already, then you do it now. How do you operationalize this, first of all? How do you go about making this measurable in any way? Okay, let's do the third one. Opposites attract. Tell me, how do you operationalize opposites? Correct, Arya. For the earlier questions, yeah. I would say a researcher who is more interested in finding out the frequency would be more interested in actually finding out the negative effects, right? Possible research question: differences in core preferences make people feel more attracted to be or curious about each other. Correct. How did you operationalize the opposites? Opposites को आपने बोला differences in core preferences. Now even this is a little ambiguous. What kind of preferences do you mean, right? If you actually were to measure this, what would you do? Okay, lifestyle is one preference. Opposite in terms of lifestyle choices. For example, if someone is a very homebody type of person, someone who enjoys spending their evenings at home or their spare time relaxing at home, versus someone who likes to go out a lot more and doesn't want to really stay at home. So someone who scores higher. So first of all, we need to find some kind of a questionnaire that measures these kind of lifestyle preferences. And based on a higher or a lower score on this, we will call them opposites. This is the process of operationalization. Opposites could be in terms of traits, values, habits, definitely. But in uh, when you're doing a research, it has to be a bit more pointed, right? And if you are actually taking opposite in such a comprehensive uh, way, then you have to cover the full breadth of it. If you actually want to call it opposites, just opposites, right? So if you want to, unless you want to do that, you have to call it something very measurable, very specific. So personality opposites or opposites in terms of lifestyle preferences is a good thing. Yeah, opposites in terms of values. Maybe doing a 16 PF on both people. Yeah, so personality opposites इससे हमको पता चल जाएंगे. Attract होते हैं कि नहीं होते हैं किससे पता चलेगा? How do we operationalize attract? Do people who have opposite preferences in lifestyle more likely to marry in the future? Mm-mm. Attract and marry are two very different things. Social scientists will tell you. Attraction is one ingredient in the recipe of marriage, but it's not fair it's not a fair translation to translate attract into marriage, right? In India, maybe. How highly would they rate the likelihood of going on a second date with that person? Sure, right? That could be gleaned or that could be inferred as a sign of attraction. If you are attracted to someone, so this is the kind of reasoning that you are applying. If you are attracted to someone, you are more likely to want to go on a second date with them, right? So yeah, if you were to operationalize this, you have to think of these very specific terms. What do you mean by opposite? What do you mean by attract? What is the process by which you are looking at it? Are you looking at marriage as the start of attraction or culmination of attraction, right? All of this has to be definitely informed from the literature review, right? But the main hypothesis would be something like, okay, uh, people who score in different, or rather, people who have a score of almost 4 points. ऐसा बोल सकते हैं. This is a very highly operationalized version of this. People who have a discrepancy of 4 points in each of their personality traits, right? So this is what I would call someone who is, or like two people who are personality-wise opposites, right? Are more likely to report that, okay, I would say that if, for example, they meet this person or, I introduce a profile to them and I tell them about certain characteristics, etc., ye, wo, vagera, right? And I tell them to rate, do you find this person attractive or not on a scale of 1 to 10, right? So this is one way to measure attraction. How attracted are you to this person? Okay, right? So to be able to actually translate a relatively, very simple query that we have about the world, to be able to conduct research on it, we have to be able to operationalize it. We have to be able to make it a variable, right? And we have to understand the nature of the relationship also. Like I said, okay, multiple factors go here. We have spoken about this thing, okay, literature review is the main thing often that leads to all these questions and leads to our hypotheses, right? Based on the literature review that you have come across, you will be asking similar kinds of questions, right? For example, if you study neurological studies, vagera, if you are looking for this answer for what causes depression, you're more likely to go the very genetic route. You're more likely to go the uh, neurogenerative route, right? And you're more likely to look at it as hormones, neurotransmitters के issues है, etc., etc., right? If you are looking at social studies or like environmental impact of uh, in the development of depression, these kind of studies, if you look at, you're more likely to form a question which is more of, is social isolation a contributing factor? Does exposure to discrimination make people more vulnerable to depressive symptoms, right? Depending on the literature review, you're going to ask certain specific questions, right? I hope some kind of an idea you have about how to actually operationalize. How do we measure? How do we quantify? Right? Moving on to today's class. Is the screen visible? Okay. Sampling in psychological research. Today we're going to cover sampling and ethics, right? Again, I'm assuming that many of you might have some kind of background information about it, but if you don't, please let me know. And if there is some at some point you don't understand, so then also let me know. Okay. Basically, what we are going to cover today is sampling and its significance, probabilistic and non-probabilistic sampling, or what I like to call it, probabilistic and non-probabilistic ways of recruiting people, right? So, what is a sample and what is a population? Correct. If I were to, for example, study, I want to conduct a research study on Indian psychology students. I want to know what are their personality profiles like. You know, are all of them higher on क्या बोलते हैं? Are all of them higher on conscientiousness? We wish. Are all of them higher on neuroticism? One study had also found this out. Okay, had reported this correlational study that people who go into psychology are, on an average, report a higher score on neuroticism than their non-psychology counterparts. Right now, this was used as, again, this is the best example of why you should not uh, mistake correlation and causation, right? Because it was not necessarily because you have neuroticism wale levels higher, that is why you went into psychology, or psychology caused your neuroticism levels to go higher, right? It could also be a secret third thing, which is, multiple factors are there, but also I feel like when you speak about emotions a lot, when there's a heightened awareness, right? We often say this statement, ignorance is bliss. Right? When you get to know stuff, get to you get bothered also by it, right? So ठीक है, I want to know Indian psychology students का क्या academic motivation है, procrastination levels कितने हैं, etc. सारी पोल खोलनी है आज, right? समझो population 1000 है, all over India there are 1000 psychology students, right? Of course, that's not the real thing, but like still, I cannot conduct a research on all the actually जो लाखों students होंगे. I cannot conduct research on all of them, and in the process of conducting research on all of them, I will also एक वो साल तो लगेगा और वो एक साल में नए psychology students भी आ जाएंगे, right? So the population is ever shifting. and it's not very probable नहीं, I would say कि it's not very realistic in a way to be able to collect data from thousands of people, right? So what we do is we take a subset of this population. We take 100 people, इंडिया के साइकोलॉजी स्टूडेंट्स का जो भी लिस्ट है मेरे पास में, उसमें से आई टेक 100 people and I call that my sample. This is the population, or this is the group that I will conduct my research on. And then I will generalize these results according to, again, I have to meet certain parameters to do that, but the aim is to generalize these results and talk about all Indian psychology students, right? On the basis of the results of this one sample. But how do I do that? There's a very philosophical, or rather a very logical question that is asked. How can you study 10 people and say, okay, these 10 people represent the population, right? Correct? That's a very big question. One of the things, and there are multiple ways that we try to solve this, and one of the ways is by improving our rigor, scientific rigor, right? So, certain basic things, I think, so that you don't get confused when you look at any book, any RM book, any research book, etc. Whenever sample and population की बात होती है, so these symbols will come in, right? Basically, whenever we are talking about characteristics of the sample, this red dot, right? Whatever, mauve dot, mauve circle, or the subset within it. We are talking about the sample, and whenever we're talking about characteristics of the sample, we talk about sample statistics, right? So the size of the sample is n. When it comes to, for example, यहाँ पे n क्या है? 100. When it comes to the population that this sample was taken from, right? यहाँ पे n क्या होगा? 1000. Because here is what I've written here. Sample का mean होता है x bar. इसका mean है x bar. Population का mean जो हम approximate करते हैं या एक extrapolate करते हैं कि अगर इसका mean इतना है, and by a statistical method we try to do that. तो इसका मीन क्या होगा? That is mu. And then I'm sure you have heard of standard deviation, bhai, right? Brilliant, I must say. And so when we talk about the standard deviation in the sample, we denote it by S. In the population, we denote it by sigma. And similarly, variance is standard deviation squared. Variance for the population is sigma squared, right? Just certain things that, so that you don't get confused, and, it's very basic, certain things that you have to remember to be able to acquire information, right? So whenever we're talking about these symbols, we are talking about all Indian psychology students, and that is always a guesstimate of sorts, right? It's an estimate, but I call it a guesstimate because it's still a very educated, very scientific, very calculated guess, right? And whenever we are using these symbols, we are talking about the sample. Okay. The primary question then becomes, okay, how do we take a sample? How can we, first of all, how can we say that, okay, these people can represent the whole population, or this small sample can represent the whole population? To be able to do that, we have certain standards or certain ways of ensuring rigor, right? मतलब the way in which that we are doing it, or the systematic way that we are trying to approach this, ensures that the sample represents the population to a great degree, right? If I say Indian psychology students and I only take Mumbai ka psychology students, that is not a good representative sample, right? I cannot call it Indian psychology students पे एक study हुआ था, right? Of course, they are Indian psychology students, but it is ethically or rather intellectually dishonest to say, to only conduct research on Mumbai ka college student and then extrapolate that to full India. जैसे मुंबई का psyche is India का psyche, right? So this is one of the main ethical issues here. Why do we do sampling? But often it is inconvenient and impossible at times to study the whole population. Even if everybody, the whole world got together and tried to do a research which has like the full population for, like, for example, all humans on earth. Every new second, minute, something, some baby is being born. How can we even? So, in those kind of situations, it is impossible. And in certain situations where the population is reachable, for example, it's a very small population. समझो कोई tribe है, उसको उसकी research study करना चाह रहे हैं. It is sure the population can be studied, right? But again, even if the tribe is like 500 or like 5,000, it's much more, it becomes much more inconvenient rather, right? That's why we do sampling, क्योंकि population पे study करना बहुत मुश्किल है and impossible at times. Isn't this cheating? It kind of is, it kind of isn't, right? We have to take this with a pinch of salt, okay? Because we otherwise we will not be able to do any kind of research. We will not be able to make any kind of claims about the population at all, right? But does that mean that all is true and all is fair? No. There are ways where we have to ensure that the sample that we are taking or the piece that we are taking out of the full population represents or is part of this population and it has all the features of that the population has, right? So how can the question then becomes, how can the sample be a good representative of the population? How can we say that our results are representative of all Indian psychology students while taking only some of them for our study? That is where sampling comes in, and that is where the types of sampling come in, right? So let's take a look at this. These are certain sampling benefits of sampling and the issues that exist with sampling. Here, a 5-star rating by 19 people is a little dubious, right? But a 4.6 rating by 2,280 people, this kind of an analysis we do every time, usually when we buy stuff, right? This is much more credible. But isn't 5-star more lucrative? 19 people have given 5 stars. Why is 4.6 stars given by 2,280 people more lucrative? More people, more diverse population, sure. We always also have this fear, okay, the 19 people may have just, क्या बोलते हैं, may have been bots or paid reviewers, right? In very reality, in the example. Larger sample size, definitely. A larger sample size, even if it reflects certain, a lesser point, right? It still is much more meaningful than a smaller sample size with a very high rating. More people, more diverse population, which we assume is more accurately reflecting the population and its nuances. Correct. You can pay 19 people, but you can't pay 2K plus people. Well, you can, but still, the people who have paid will not, we apply this kind of reason. The people who have paid will not give a rating of less than 5. Sometimes we are also very cautious of people or or like थोड़ा सा critical आना चाहिए. It shouldn't be too good to be true, right? वो वाले senses भी थोड़ा activate हो जाता है. But in general, a larger sample size is much more reflective of the truth in our eyes, right? And statistically also. But there is a problem in the way that we collect participants or we gather a sample, right? Take a look at this and tell me what the problem is. We received 500 responses and found that people love responding to surveys. 99.8 people have said, 99.8% people have said, yes, I love responding to surveys. And 0.2 people have percent of people have said, no, I tossed them in the bin. Tell me what is the problem here? Why is this? Humans. We'll call them individuals. So every individual in India, for example, every Indian psychology student in India has to have an equal chance of getting selected. That is what probabilistic sampling entails. ये random होना चाहिए. Whoever is selected has to get selected on a very random basis and has to have an equal chance, right? Now again, very unlikely because for this often you need a more क्या बोलते हैं a complete list of all people, right? To be able to pick and choose. If I just put out a क्या बोलते हैं newspaper में ad, it does not necessarily mean that random sampling हो गया, right? नहीं. And non-probabilistic sampling is a way of sampling that does not care about this that much, right? Often out of logistic reasons, like it is not possible only, right? Convenience के लिए होता है, less resource intensive होता है, you know. If I want to do only Mumbai का psychology student, I'll say Mumbai के psychology students and be done with it, right? The selection criteria and so probabilistic sampling is more deliberate, is more rigor oriented and focused, and it claims to be unbiased, and therefore stronger statistical inferences can be drawn, right? But truly, when you think about things, इतना random होना possible नहीं है unless you have some kind of a comprehensive list, right? The types of probabilistic sampling are simple random sampling, stratified random sampling. We'll go through these: systematic and cluster sampling. Non-probabilistic sampling is usually done out of two reasons. Like I said, one is convenience, and one is there is a very specific population, and there is a criteria that needs to be met. For example, if I say I need therapists who are working with other therapists. Now that is a very niche population, right? I can't really have probabilistic sampling or random sampling. I do not have a list of all the therapists who are conducting therapy with therapists, right? It's going to take a lot of time. And because I have such a very specific criteria, I can use non-probabilistic sampling. You have any so far? We know of convenience sampling, we know of purposive sampling, and snowball sampling. Convenience sampling is the sampling that you do. फ्रेंड्स को पूछ लिया, नेबर्स को पूछ लिया, क्लासमेट्स को पूछ लिया, प्लीज पार्टिसिपेट कर लो हमारे रिसर्च में, राइट? आई एम श्योर यू आर वेरी intimately familiar with this, right? Let's look at now random sampling or the types of probabilistic sampling. Simple random sampling is often requires a full list of the population. That is why it is often required. It's very difficult to actually, for example, get Indian psychology students ka pura list, right? So it's often a much more like, hit and miss type of situation. I can take, for example, if I want to take Maharashtra ke sare students, I still have to ensure that Mumbai Maharashtra hai. I can technically say that these are Maharashtrian students, but are Mumbai students, uh, are their needs the same as the students in Dhule, Amarner, right? Not really. सिंपल सैम्पलिंग का एग्जांपल है जब आप एक्सपेरिमेंट के लिए जाते हो, व्हेन यू गो फॉर एन लाइक योर एग्जाम वगैरह, यू पिक आउट अ चिट फ्रॉम मल्टीपल ऑफ द चिट, ओके, राइट? दैट इज अ वेरी गुड एग्जांपल ऑफ सिंपल रैंडम सैम्पलिंग, लाइक ऐसे आंख बंद करके कोई भी एक चिट उठा लेना, राइट? सो फॉर एग्जांपल इफ आई हैव अ लिस्ट ऑफ ऑल ऑफ योर पार्टिसिपेंट्स and I randomly arrive at a name and I say pick out one person and say you tell me the answer to this, right? Very teaching to do. That would be simple random sampling. But again, you can see how even in the randomness of it, I could be more primed to, for example, there are colors here. I could be primed to select one color over the other colors. I may have a favorite color. There may be more people with the name S, with the name starting with S. So there might be like a full list. So I might select a person whose name starts with S. The likelihood of me selecting a person whose name starts with S is much more likely, much more high. And or it could also be like, I see so many S's, I'm like, I don't want to select someone S. It's very predictable, right? So very demand characteristics and countering the demand characteristics also. It's very clear. Systematic random sampling may picking the nth unit, regular intervals पे. So for example, abhi there are 61 people here, right? I take every 10th person in my research study. For example, I take Chitra Shri, then I skip 5 and I take Geetika. Then I skip 5 and I take Juhi, right? I can do this on and on and on. So somewhere there's also this ensuring that, okay, all people have a random chance. Then we have stratified random sampling. One of the more complex and, it's considered one of the more robust forms of random sampling. Stratified random sampling means groups are divided into subgroups from which units are picked. Individual units are picked. For example, socioeconomic strata बोलते हैं ना, right? That is what we mean by stratified, right? We create these kind of categories of people and then we pick. For example, if I have to pick therapists in India, right? First, I will have to pick India. मतलब क्या? India मतलब काफी सारे स्टेट. हर स्टेट में से, हर डिस्ट्रिक्ट में से I'll take 10 therapists, right? But also, there's also this thing that there are more female therapists than male therapists. So if I want to ensure like a proper sample, then I need to ensure that, okay, there are two categories here also. Okay, there are समझो 50 if I'm taking just a sample of 100, and if there are 100 male therapists and 200 female therapists, I will take 50 male therapists and I will take 50 female therapists. So that is more of the spirit of stratified random sampling. It can equalize this, right? Taking 10 students from each college in Mumbai, right, can suffice. Stratified random sampling. Like, you create subgroup and then each subgroup से एक individual you pick, right? एक individual नहीं, rather, I would say you pick uh, the participants or units, right? Cluster sampling, on the other hand, you take naturally existing groups as samples and randomly select clusters of units instead of individual units, right? It is often the weakest form of random sampling. I'll tell you why. So let's go here. So if this is the population, okay, wait, this is disappearing. This is the population, and this is India. Sorry, I divide India in north. I don't, but like we, for the sampling purposes, we divide west, east, and south. So we take, if I have 200 का sample लेना है मुझे, so I'll take 50 from here, I'll take 50 from here, I'll take 50 from here. So like I'll do this, right? यहाँ से भी like गुजरात से कुछ लेने हैं, यहाँ पे थोड़ा राजस्थान के एरिया में से कुछ लेने हैं, साउथ में से भी कर्नाटका, केरला, एक्सेट्रा, तमिलनाडु, राइट, ईस्ट में से अरुणाचल, मिजोरम, राइट. तो यहाँ से इंडिविजुअल पिकिंग्स करते हैं. बट व्हेन इट कम्स टू क्लस्टर सैम्पलिंग, what I'll do is I'll divide in clusters for sure, and I'll take, for example, these two clusters for no reason, for no good reason. I'll take these two clusters and I'll be like, हाँ, इनमें से जो भी मैं लेती हूँ, they will be representative of the sample, right? That is why it is one of the weaker forms of random sampling, right? For example, if I want to know कि, like I said, मुंबई के psychology students के बारे में personality profile बनाना चाह रही हूँ मैं, right? So what I will do is I will identify certain colleges, and out of the 10 colleges, I will take 4 colleges. Whereas in stratified random sampling, I will make sure to take from each college 10 students, and उसमें भी gender wise distribution देखूंगी. Multiple levels पे stratified होता है ये, right? So it is more systematic, definitely more resource intensive also that way, right? Clear about this? Like checking if the rice is properly cooked by picking out and tasting 1 grain of rice from anywhere in the cooker. Now that I would say is more of convenience sampling. If you just like, take the full up upper wala rice and you're like, it is cooked, right? But if you take different parts of the rice, like, okay, bottom का भी थोड़ा लेते हैं, middle वाले layer का भी थोड़ा लेते हैं, okay, आँच इस तरफ ज़्यादा थी, तो ये side का भी लेंगे, ये side का भी लेंगे. That is more of stratified sampling. Cluster sampling would be, I'll just take इधर का थोड़ा सा, इधर का थोड़ा सा, and then I have some kind of variety. Make sense? Samvi? Okay, right? Right. Moving on, non-probabilistic sampling. Like I said, one of the more convenient वाला चीज के, like, convenient sampling है कि logistic reasons के लिए होता है mostly. Easily accessible कौन है? We do this all the time. We tell our badger our friends to participate in our researches, our social networks, etc. Easily accessible whoever it is. Neighbors, classmates, friends. यूनिवर्सिटी में अगर कोई आसपास घूमता रहेगा तो उसको पार्टिसिपेट लेके आते हैं काफी सारे बार स्टूडेंट्स. So it's always fun, right? But is that really representative? I don't know. And the way that the sampling or the selection has been done, does that ensure that we get a good representative sample of the population? No. Purposive sampling, depends on who meets the research criteria. For example, people who have treatment resistant depression, very few people. Very few people, matlab, like still a very niche population, right? So you are going to select only these people. So you, it's not, it does not matter here कि कितना random sampling वगैरह करना है. What matters here is that they meet the research criteria. Then we have snowball sampling. It's uh, the Salman Khan method, जो जय हिंद में था कि like, you help three people and then you tell the three people to help three other people, right? So similarly, you find two participants and then you tell them कि you also find two participants for me now. Isn't it cluster sampling में every cluster will have units from every part. Like if there's five clusters, then each cluster will have numbers of N, E, W, S, like a pyramid scheme but research. Yes. Uh, Tushar, I'm afraid I don't understand your question, and I'm afraid we don't even have the time. And we select any cluster out of the five. First subclusters में all four parts are present. We assume that's the problem, right? We assume a cluster is representative of the subgroup, right? And that is the problem here. That is why it is the weakest form of sampling, right? Please pass this on to other psychology students you know in your circle. Recruiting via your existing participants, right? And then we have quota sampling, which is basically a set percentage of individuals you choose from different subgroups of the population. For example, if I say 20 students from each college in Mumbai, which teaches psychology, that now we'll move on to ethics in psychological research and experimentation. Now I understand this is a much more uh, this is a topic which requires a much more in-depth conversation, right? I don't think we can talk about ethics without talking about violation of ethics. I remember once a student had asked me when I had quota sampling is basically you set a quota, okay, like okay, इसमें से हम इतना 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 लेंगे. You create subgroups, but the problem with quota sampling and the difference between quota sampling, cluster sampling, and stratified random sampling is stratified random sampling requires you to have a very good comprehensive knowledge of what the population actually looks like, right? I have to have a good knowledge of all the districts, all the क्या बोलते हैं uh, colleges of psychology that exist and all the kind of bifurcations इसमें हो सकते हैं. Geographical bifurcation easy है, but if I say कि in India, socioeconomic status is a created category, right? That is why other countries may just have like lower socioeconomic status, middle, and higher. We have lower middle BPL, lower, then we have lower middle, we have middle, we have upper middle, right? So this kind of knowledge is required about the population, which is what makes stratified random sampling a much more difficult and therefore a much more reliable form of random sampling. Okay. Now we come to ethics in psychological research. One, the main things here, what we'll talk about is informed consent and confidentiality. We'll talk about deception. We'll talk about reporting the research results, which we often don't talk about, and following ethical standards. How can we do that, right? These are certain very basic standards to follow. A researcher is obligated to protect participants from physical or emotional or mental stress, including when possible stress that might arise due to participants' misconceptions about the psychological task. I remember once, so we had to ensure that the participants take the least amount of time, and system होने वाला था, right? And one of the experimenters, so one of the students said that maybe we can tell them, okay, like okay, these points are related to our marks, so please answer carefully, right? So this could definitely achieve the result. Like people will answer more seriously and will take the point system more seriously. But it puts a person under undue stress to be responsible for a friend's mark, right? So there is a lot of risk involved here, correct? So it's not just that we have to protect the participants from harm, but we have to inform them about any possible harm. And we have to, for that, we have to have knowledge about what are the possible ways in which this can be harmful, right? We will not think, like, something like this can be actually harmful. But putting the client or putting the participant under this kind of undue stress can also be neglect and unethical, therefore, right? Then deception. Now, deception has a very risk benefit analysis that you have to do, right? What level of deception is okay? How much deception is, what is the risk and what is the benefit, right? Who is the benefit for also? When it comes to medical trials, often the क्या बोलते हैं often the benefit is for the participant only, right? If this medication works, you will feel much better, and that is why in researches where they find that the efficacy of one medicine is higher than the control or the placebo, they automatically क्या बोलते हैं stop the study and give the medicine to all the groups, right? यहाँ पे this is the ethical part of research, right? डिसेप्शन भी हम क्यों कर रहे हैं, किस लेवल का कर रहे हैं, और ये इससे क्या रिस्क हो सकता है पार्टिसिपेंट्स को. ऑल ऑफ दीज आर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चंस टू आस्क, right? Reporting research results is also as important, if not more important, because how you report and what you report definitely has repercussions in the real world, right? We'll come to that. Let's look at this. A researcher has an ethical responsibility to make clear to the participant about what the research entails, right? Again, you don't have to tell everything, but you have to tell at least some bit of it, something that they should know, right? And this involves involving a lot of the stakeholders and taking guidance from other people who are serving. So there's something called an ethical review board that is supposed to be there, that is supposed to be instituted in all institutes where studies are done. But sadly, because of the non-support or like systemic support जो नहीं है इंडिया में colleges and universities को, तो उसकी वजह से कभी कभार this does not extend to psychology students, right? Which is a shame, which is unfortunate, right? Any possible risk to the to the participant, you have to be sure of and you have to inform. Informed consent का मतलब है कि ये नहीं कि उनको बता देना, उनको हर चीज बताना, and they have to understand also. That is also part of informed consent. So they have to understand what they are signing up for and the full breadth of it. Respect the dignity and rights of individuals during the research experience. When it comes to reporting research results, disseminating of sensitive information without their permission is a serious breach of ethics. You cannot include names. You do not include identifying information, confidentiality and anonymity. दोनों में फर्क है और दोनों ही अपहोल्ड करने होता है. Even in qualitative research, whenever data is being reported or quotes are being reported, it's always mentioned कि initials दिए जाते हैं. You never mention the names, you never mention any kind of information that could possibly make the identification of this person possible, right? I remember one researcher was doing this research on colorism in the black community, right? And at the end of the research, people are expecting to find some kind of descriptive statistics about, how much colorism is prevalent and how much it is not, right? But they said that due to the possibility that this information could be misinterpreted and misreported and used for more nefarious purposes, right? We are not reporting the descriptive statistics. कि black community में colorism कितना है, right? Now this is very responsible reporting. because it could have a negative consequence for an already vulnerable group, right? Which is harmful and ultimately unethical because it is harmful, because it is violating something, because it is a violation of some kind of right. That is why we deem something unethical, right? Ethics कोई ऐसा legality के जैसा नहीं है, कोई rules के जैसा नहीं होता है, right? We define ethics by the harm, right? And prevention of harm is more core areas of how we define our ethics. When deciding whether to experiment and reasons for the experiment, like क्यों आपको बेवकूफ बनाया है, क्या करना जरूरी है? Cheating is very part of experimental research, psychological research of any kind. The researcher can never ethically withhold information that might seriously influence a participant's willingness to participate. If you know that this is going to take 1 hour of your time and you say 10 minutes of your time this will take, and knowing that this will influence the willingness to participate, that is also unethical, right? Because you are this is somewhere predatory because you want the response. The ultimate aim is your need, no? तो यहाँ पे तुम डिसाइड क्यों कर रहे हो, क्योंकि तुमको फायदा होना चाहिए, राइट? Voluntary participation and refusal to participate are essential rights of a participant. I know it's much difficult to follow these in your everyday or like in your academics वगैरह, मुश्किल हो जाता है कभी कभार, but ethics are always aspirational. We try to achieve them, right? And it isn't necessarily always possible, but we always try to achieve. And that's the whole point. See, like, you try to do this. Can you reduce harm, right? How can we ensure ethicality? Find out all the facts of the situation. What are the possible risks that can be there? Identify the ethical issues that are relevant. ऐसा रिसर्च करेंगे अगर तो क्या क्या रिस्क आ सकते हैं? Decide what is at stake. Any kind of, for example, any kind of IQ testing reporting. Very, very difficult, very, very sensitive a topic, right? Sexuality के बारे में कुछ भी reporting होना, very sensitive, right? Decide what is at stake for all parties involved, participants, researchers, institutions, even society, right? The researchers who did not report the results of the black population were thinking of society at that point, right? Identify alternative methods or procedures, discuss the consequences of each alternative, and decide on the option to be taken, action to be taken. Now, apart from these ethics, this is the last slide. We'll be done. Oh, we are on time. Right. Apart from, so what these ethical issues or neglect of these ethical issues has resulted in is three big issues in psychological science today. One is the replicability crisis, which is a very huge. एक तो सैम्पलिंग वाला एक डिसऑनेस्टी होता है कि ओके यू हैव रिपोर्टेड फेक डेटा, लेवल थोड़ा सा नीचे है, बट आई वुड से स्टिल वेरी डिसऑनेस्ट इज तोड़ मरोड़ोइंग डेटा to follow your hypothesis. That can also be done. It's called data dredging, right? There is a idiom that is said, if you torture data enough, it will confess to everything, or rather, it will confess to anything, right? So one of the interpretation is that you can, you know, poke data to, confess to anything. You can make it follow your hypothesis, etc., whatever, right? Second is, तो ये वाला dishonesty होता है, and then there is the bias, which is you've not conducted your sampling properly, you've not conducted your participation or research participants के साथ आपने बराबर से conduct नहीं किया है, ये सब की वजह से आपने रिसर्च समझा नहीं है बराबर से. Because of all of this, psychology has a replicability crisis. Most of our even very good studies are non-replicable or are finding uh, new data is suggesting that जितना स्ट्रॉन्ग रिजल्ट्स दिख रहे थे, जितना सिग्निफिकेंट रिजल्ट्स दिख रहे थे, उतने सिग्निफिकेंट रिजल्ट्स नहीं है. दैट इज व्हाई वी आर रिलाइंग मोर एंड मोर ऑन मेटा एनालिसिस एंड सिस्टमिक रिव्यूज, राइट? Meta-analysis is an analysis of all the research papers on one single topic, on one single relationship sometimes, right? So because of the whole sampling bias, because of the whole this idea of not placing ethics as a responsibility, we have the replicability crisis. Then we have a major psychological issue. Isn't that also just a product of doing research in a discipline like psychology itself? Definitely. I think psychology by itself has, we need to acknowledge the harm that we have done to actually be able to mend it, right? It does not mean that, क्या बोलते हैं, just because psychology is subjective does not mean that everything goes. रिगोर को इस तरह से हम नहीं छोड़ सकते. दैट इज वाई हमारा नाम खराब हो गया है साइंटिफिक कम्युनिटी में, राइट? नाउ इट्स आवर रेस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी. Then we have the publication bias or the file drawer effect. The file drawer effect or the bias is called because all the negative results or insignificant results are put in a file drawer and then closed for eternity. Only the significant results are reported. But isn't it also more important to note that there is no relationship between these two variables? It is as important to know that there is no relationship as important it is to know that there is a relationship, right? But वो publication bias, and publishing, publish, first of all. And secondly, to publish significant results is such a huge drain. And that is why science is not being followed in a ethical way, in a scientific way even, right? When you take away the ethics of it, the science of it also goes away very soon. And then one of the other things is the exploitative research. Now, many more people and many more, psychology graduates, etc., are doing research with vulnerable populations. LGBTQ population हो गई, सेक्स वर्कर्स के साथ कर रहे हैं रिसर्च, किड्स पे रिसर्च कर रहे हैं, राइट? You have to ask this question, okay? If you are trying to dredge up the pain, if you are trying to find out about these things, how well do you know the community, how well do you know the group, how are you contributing to this? Will your research actually help them or will it only help you, right? So these are very, and we also have something called predatory journals, which is a more like academic issue, which is that people pay and get their articles published, which is really unethical and which contributes to, like I said, nonsense rather, right? So yeah, that's it for today. I think you all, if you have any questions, okay, Tushar, you had a question. Isn't it a cluster sampling? May every cluster will have units from every part. It's not necessary. For example, just because I take, for example, I want to study एक organization है, उसके multiple branches है. Just taking Delhi and Mumbai branches does not mean that I can give some kind of a good estimate about all the other branches. जो मुंबई और दिल्ली के ब्रांच है, वो छत्तीसगढ़ के ब्रांच के से कितने डिफरेंट रहेंगे? It's not ensured, no, because we are taking in cluster sampling, we are taking naturally existing groups. We are not picking individuals from each cluster or group, which is what we are doing in stratified random sampling. Tushar, I hope that answers your question. Okay. Anybody else has a question? Okay, I don't think so. Then, Sanjana, I think if Rituja is here, she can start in another 2 minutes.
Yeah, hi guys, I
Okay.
am here. Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm
Thank you,
audible.
everyone. Rutuja, I will leave all the very best.
Thank you. Yeah. Am I audible, guys? Okay, great. Okay, I will now share my screen, and I hope we don't have the issues like last time. Just give me 1 second. Okay, I think my screen is visible, right? Yeah. All right, so today we will be studying about neurodevelopmental disorders, which are like in, like popularly or in other forms of literature, we are calling neurodivergence, right? As well as like on the internet, a lot of people also call, neurodivergence as neurospiciness or like, oh, I'm neurospicy, which basically, you don't have to, like for a lot of reasons, because maybe with the clinical connotation with regards to like these disorders, so like for those reasons people might use the word neurospicy. So that just basically means that they are ND, which is neurodivergent. So before we go ahead with the disorders, and because we have like an hour only, i I have decided that we'll first have a discussion about like neurodivergence in general, and then do like one disorder. All right. So, can you guys, like, from your understanding, can you tell me, like, you can comment? I've also joined from my phone, so I can read the comments now without switching back and forth. So, what is your understanding, like, especially in the recent times on Instagram and Twitter, like, and Reddit as well, like, neurotypical or neurodivergent, ADHD, especially, has been very, very, very popular. So, can you guys quickly tell me, like, what is your understanding of neurotypical brain? Doesn't exist. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? Like, does no one? Okay. A brain that works differently requires different kinds of stimulations. All right. That is one way to look at it. Yes. Okay, so I will only like thank you for answering Aditi and Shambhavi. So basically, when we say neurodivergence or like neurodevelopmental disorders, right? So as the name suggests, it is like the way the brain is right structured and the way the brain is, and certain neurotransmitters and things like that, right? Based on that, the way we basically perceive the world. Like, for example, if I ask you guys to, could you explain me, like, your like when you enter your college, right? Can you tell me like the route from the gate till your class? Can you guys quickly just, explain me, like, if you could just give a quick explanation right from the gate of the college, like how is like, way towards your classroom. I think this everyone should be able to answer, right? Like, how would you describe it? Just whatever. There's no right or wrong answers. Just your description of, from the gate of your college to your classrooms. Is okay. Are people typing, but I'm not able to see here? Okay. Yes. Okay. So no one wants to answer that question. Uh, okay. And you enter the gate and go to the ramp and then boom. Okay. Thank you, Tushar, for answering. Juhi has answered enter the main gate, show ID card to security, walk for 15 minutes on the sidewalk, enjoying greenery, reach department, sit in class. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Juhi, as well. So, like it's just like one simple question, right? It's about like how do you like, can you just describe me? Okay, Paru has also oh, that's all right, Paru. Thank you for your reply. So, like just one simple question, right? Like, can you describe me, like, your route or the when you enter your college gate and to the way towards your classroom, right? So, what is this like? How do you perceive this, right? Like my route. So, like Tushar mentioned, ki, okay, I study in a hospital, enter the gate, go to the ramp, first floor, boom, I reach. And then if you look at Jui's answer, right, thoda more elaborate, right? So it's just like neurotypical. I'm not saying कि Jui has a neurotypical or neurodivergent brain. I'm just giving an example कि how we perceive things, right? Like maybe a neurodivergent person might perceive way more details. Maybe they might look at certain patterns. They might look at certain colors. They might be keeping track of certain things like greenery is mentioned here, right? Maybe you might be keeping track of certain trees, or some people might just like, like, okay, this is how I have to go, right? So some even in neurodivergence, right, it's a big spectrum. That day before yesterday we discussed how even if it is one disorder, the way it manifests in different people, like 10 different people can be in 10 different ways, right? So neurotypical versus neurodivergent, right? Usually, in most offices, most schools, most systems, right? The way we go about things is designed in the neurotypical manner. Where, as the word suggests, typical, which is the norm, right? Like, this is the way you have to talk, this is the way you should be sitting, this is the way you should be like eating food, or like you should be making friends, you are in this age, so you should be having so and so, like these number of maybe friends or like romantic relationships, things like that, right? So every system that we exist in usually follows neurotypical like construct, or like the way of doing things or perceiving things, right? But recently, in the recent years, because of awareness, because a lot of corporate organizations are also trying to be more inclusive, right? So they are trying to make more their workplaces, or even schools are trying their best to, some of the schools are trying, or colleges, trying their best to accommodate all students, right? But on a, like on a large scale, most of the world works in a neurotypical manner. And this is again, like, I want you, whenever we're doing clinical, I want you to look at, like, are we looking at it from a medical model? Do I want to look at it from a medical model, or a social model, or a diversity model, right? So if you look at it from a diversity model, it is the infrastructure, or it is the way the rules of different places are that are there, which will cause issues for people who have neurodivergence or neurodevelopmental disorders, right? Also, another thing, like, just because it is like a clinical, of course it is a clinical concept, but there can be individuals who might not process information, or the way they perceive things, or the way they communicate, right? It might not be in a neurotypical manner, right? Their brains might not be neurotypical, but at the same time they might not have a disorder, right? It can be like depending on the functioning that is getting affected or not, or maybe they have a very accommodative, very loving family environment. The school that they go to, the college that they go to is also very accessible, very inclusive, so they do not end up having an issue, so then it might not get considered as a disorder. And sometimes, like, some people just can be on the neurodivergent spectrum, but they might just because they're different and they do not function the neurotypical manner. So it doesn't always have to be a disorder, it doesn't always have to, we don't have to look at neurodivergence in a very clinical lens, is what I'm saying. Okay. So now let's look at like neurodivergence, which is again like you can see there are like a number of disorders that come into this umbrella, right? And in the DSM, if you have a look, like there are a list of neurodevelopmental disorders. So the categorization might not be same, but you should be aware with whatever trends that are happening in the literature in the research world, right? So this is about like just the foundation of neurotypical and neurodivergent. Yes, correct, Tushar. Also, if you guys have any doubts, whenever, just like raise your hand so that I'll look at the chat. Now, you might have heard, okay, but doesn't everyone feel that way, right? Like, there are people who say, okay, but everyone's a little autistic. Like, why are you, you're not so special. Everyone's a little autistic. I also feel that way. This person also feels that way, right? So, we shouldn't like invalidate them. That should be the very first reaction. It's okay, there could be a chance where some people might genuinely be, like neurodivergent, right? Or sometimes like you can just explain them or like to understand you, but everyone feels that way, right? So what matters here is ki, like it's the same thing with what we discussed with depression, ki everyone will feel depressed, everyone will feel anxious, but it's the duration and the intensity and the way it is affecting their different domains of life, right? So when it starts affecting, when the intensity is high, that is when it becomes a disorder, right? So like here this is taken from this Color Me Neurospicy page, right? They've done a very good job in explaining this. So as you can see, and usually like this is how we try to understand like a lot of like neurodevelopmental disorders. Earlier we used to have like a line, like like low functioning to high functioning, but this is a more non-clinical approach to understand. It's more elaborate, like we will discuss about low functioning and high functioning. It's a thoda ableist concept, right? So this is a better way of understanding. So like in practice, like if you're like assessing an individual or you are doing therapy, you can use these wheel structures so that it's better for them also to explain ki, okay, yeah, this is what I feel and this is the intensity. If you like, if you guys remember the wheel of emotions from CBT, right, where we help them identify and label emotions, and then we give them like a homework, okay, give a percentage or rate those emotions. So that's like similar kind of thing. So here, as you can see, okay, a neurotypical person might experience these things like stimming, for example. I hope everyone knows stimming. Stimming is like, so repetitive behavior, or fidgeting, right? Some people might call it fidgeting, right? So a lot of people have a habit of, let's say, fidgeting there, like they'll keep on shaking their leg, or they'll keep on tapping their hand. That does not make a person autistic, or or they might have like certain disorder. Like, so everyone can have like these things, but then again, relatively or compared to other behaviors and those things also we have to look at. And as you can see, the spectrum. So ADHD, so a lot of times, like the comorbidity for autism and ADHD, like individuals who do have autism or ADHD could have both. Sometimes it's just ADHD, just autism, but there's a lot more chances of comorbidity. That's why ADHD, right? So you can see the spectrum is much more higher, right? And here they've shown like a neurotypical experience, ADHD experience, autistic, and ADHD plus autistic experience. So vast differences there. So yes, everyone does feel that way, but the intensity and the duration and the way it affects their maybe personal relationships, the way work situations happen, might not be the same. Okay, now let's look at like the major issues that folks with neurodivergence face, right? Um, So even while training, right, when you open your DSM or you open your synopsis, right, for both even clinical and counseling, counseling may usually the focus is on childhood only, but in clinical it is supposed to be throughout, like, lifespans, right? But whatever training that is done or the books that we refer to, it is only like, like childhood focus, as if, in, like, it's just like the child just grows out of their ADHD, they just grow out of their autism, it just, vanishes once they pass teenagehood. And adults with like ADHD or autistic adults do not exist. So that is a very major gap in the literature for neurodevelopmental disorders, where, a lot of, like, majority of the literature that is there, which means the research work, right, regarding right from diagnosis, assessment to treatment or management plans, is largely focused on children. And even while the train while we when we train, the focus is on, a lot of it is on kids, right, and how to understand, identify those signs or things like that. But then what happens when, like, a child does, maybe for whatever reasons, the parents are not able to take the child to a doctor, like a, a counselor or a therapist, then of course, like, as an adult, the person will have issues, right? That does not mean they do not have it. So that's one major issue where, a lot of literature is focused on childhood, right, and a lot of it again is focused on curing or treating these things, right? A lot of, like, not just here in India, but even like in America, some of you might have heard where, a lot of Americans are against vaccines because they think vaccine causes autism or ADHD. So, they do not like vaccinate their kids for those reasons. So, a lot of, or, like, there are other ways where in India as well, parents do try their best. It's coming from, yes, stigma, but also a lot of times, like, it's also coming from a place of care, so they would take the kids to, all different alternatives and try to correct autism, correct, like ADHD, right? So SNES, it is important, like, we should learn how to manage, we need to have treatment or management plans, but that can't be the sole reason, right? What is also important is, along with, like, managing or treating whatever, the goal of the kid or a person is, so treatment can be used. It's not that we completely get rid of the word treatment, right? Sometimes it can be like for certain things, and sometimes we use like management, right? More inclusive language. So yeah, like, what we also need to do, and this has to be done in an institutional on an institutional level, right, where we are making the world more accessible for all, right? Like, we are not functioning through or looking at the world or functioning from a neurotypical lens. We're functioning in a way that every person should be able to function without, facing issues, right? Things are There are certain things which you can do on an individual level, where, the language that you use, the way, a lot of times, like, we'll see, Abhi, that, kids might uh, kids who have neurodevelopmental disorders are more vulnerable to bullying, right? So SNEK, all the responsibilities on the institution, there is fair amount of responsibility on you as an individual, and a lot of things that, you know um, you can do. Okay, is there adult women? Okay, I'll just, can you put the PPT in slideshow mode? I can, but yesterday when I did that, the screen went blank. That's why I have not put it on slideshow mode. And correct. The word elaborately speaks to experiences of people with varying perception, psychosis. Correct. So, what Gitika has said, like, everyone, if you can just read her message or their message, right? It's so the this discussion, right? This is a discourse among professionals, where some professionals want to keep it limited want to keep divergence limited to neurodevelopmental disorders or perception disorders, and some others also want to have like at psychosis, schizophrenia, BPD as well, so that is an ongoing discourse that is happening, and it depends from individual to individual. So there's no right or wrong as of now, that what comes under neurodivergence. There's like a common agreement, like this chunk of people think, okay, these, like, the neurodevelopmental disorders. Then there's another chunk of people who feel even, like disorders like schizophrenia or BPD should also come under those things, like certain mental disorders as well, because it does change the way you perceive things, the way you perceive information, the way you communicate, the way you feel things, right? Which can be different than most other people. So, yes, thank you, Gitika, for bringing that up. And Aditi said, is it possible that a person has ADHD and autism at the same time? What does this condition look like? Yes, it is. It is very much possible. And what does this condition look like? It's a combination of both. So like it's what, like, sometimes again it's not like every symptom of ADHD and every symptom of autism it can be combined. On some days they can have, on some, it's sometimes, for some people, like one of my clients, autism does not really cause a lot of issues. Autism, the way he perceives the world because of, being autistic, actually helps him deal with his ADHD. Right? For other people, like a lot of people say, "Okay, oh, my ADHD is my superpower," So for them, maybe autism experiences of, like due to autism can be the concern, and ADHD might not. For some people it both can be very much, like difficult to handle, maybe because of the environment. A lot of times it's because we failed as a society to be like inclusive, for all. So yeah, I hope that answers your questions. Yes. So again, like, because in the literature, it is more childhood focused. Right from the training, we put a lot of emphasis on children, but less emphasis on like adults. And even on that, like, as this meme is very great, where it's the trend. So not just with ADHD, but a lot of neurodevelopmental or neurodivergent, like boys or men do get like it's easier for them to get these diagnoses. We will look at these things in detail, and then girls do not. And then like there's adults which are just just going undiagnosed, and in that you can imagine what would happen to adult women with certain neurodivergent disorders. Right? So training itself, like, not a lot of matter, a lot of literature is, or like, we are in that developing stage of, now that we are taking like phenomenological approaches are coming into, like are being more popular. So hopefully, there is more literature in the future where why right from the training stage, we learn about adults with neurodivergence as well. And then, because like the training only is so limited, even assessment tools, you see most of the assessment tools, like there are very few assessment tools that are there, that exist. Even if the ones that are there, psychometric properties, you have to do norming, right? We don't have, like, Indian context may like hardly, so that's another issue. And then, because training and assessment is not there, literature about these things are not there, of course the treatment and management plans, because we do not know how these things look like, if from official literature, we're not able to understand, like, okay, adults with, how to diagnose them. If we are not able to diagnose them, how will we help them manage their conditions, right? So these are the very major gaps. Then major literature. So allistic basically means like people who do not have autism, those folks are called allistics, right? Allistic folks and neurotypical folks. So a lot of literature, and especially like diagnostic literature, right, is developed by people who do not experience it. And this also covers people who do not have neurodivergent disorders, so they are the ones making these without taking into consideration the experiences of people living their day to day life with autism or ADHD or learning disabilities. So, yeah, so we do not consider those actual experiences, and then it becomes very limited to just, those symptom checklist and not other things that could also show a significant possibility of, having this disorder. um Nowadays, like, especially because of like the popularity on the internet, people might feel okay, okay, nowadays, everyone is autistic, everyone has ADHD. Is this true or not? One, there is no reason to like invalidate people. There's no limited space. Like a lot of times, like, people might internalize ableism, and they might start doubting their own experiences, and they might feel okay, oh, maybe I do not have this, I'm just taking up space. But what is this imaginary space that is there? There is no limited space. This a very scarcity perspective, like, due to the system of capitalism and competition and all of those things. But like, first of all, like, if someone says, like, oh, I might have ADHD, I might be autistic, like, okay, you don't have to be invalidating. You can be like, okay, like, what makes you feel that way, or like, what are the experiences that you feel relatable and things like that. And then later, like, you can get an assessment done. And what happens is, labels for most people is very liberating, because a lot of neurodivergent folks do not, because we do not have awareness, right? We do not learn about these things. We do not learn psychological first aid in school or colleges, right? So we do not have the language to understand or to express our experiences and emotions. That's why a lot of people also, when they use ki, oh, I'm depressed or I have OCD, like, it's okay, we'll let them use it, because at that time they might be feeling those things at that intensity. So similarly for this, like, you don't have to be a police and be like, oh, everyone is autistic, everyone has ADHD. Okay, they might experience certain things, or they could not. It could just be like them having a much more difficult time, and they relate to certain things, so which is completely fine. But if we look at, like, statistics or like the recent findings, the thing is, why nowadays there are more, or like, everyone is autistic or has ADHD, because now that relatively, like, as compared to like other mental disorders, like, we have more and more literature, more and more research happening, right? People are becoming aware. There is like assessment tools being developed, again, for it can be more for children, but still at least something is being developed, right? And there's more awareness, and then people understand कि, oh, like, this is what I was experiencing, and now it makes sense, right? As I said, like, labels can be very liberating for people. So once they know, okay, what is wrong, then I can try to fix it or try to manage it, right? So it's just that, a lot of like older generations might have gone undiagnosed, or sometimes it doesn't even have to be a clinical perspective. They might just live their life in a different manner, right? So yeah, nowadays everyone, or like a lot of people, can be autistic, because we now have the tools or the means to recognize these conditions or disorders. One major issue is gender disparity, right? Again, all the research that has been done, right, all the literature that has been written, a lot of it is very boy centric. That is why, again, like, it is very easier for boys or men to get these diagnoses, but for women it gets very difficult. Another reason, one, because we've not studied how women experience these things, right? Secondly, because of, like, as in the first lecture I had mentioned, that a lot of disorders have a lot of like racial history, a lot of like misogynist or sexist history, right? So when women come in for diagnosis, like, a lot of like over representation in diagnosis for like depression, anxiety, BPD, things like that, which are like certain disorders are very gendered, right? Like, there is underdiagnosis for men in BPD, because BPD is looked as a feminine or like a hysterical disorder, more associated with women. So that's another thing. So a lot of like gender disparity, and also the way um women and men, I know, like I am speaking in binaries, but then for the, because we do not have like a very, to begin with, there's not a lot of research in general, and then of course to have that nuanced level of research we haven't reached there, so that's why I'm speaking in binaries. But because that is the research that is existing. The way women are brought up, right, and the way men are brought up, the social conditioning, the kind of expectations that are there from each gender is very different, right? So even the way the symptoms that manifest will be very different, right? And because we have a fault in our training itself, where we take a very clinical approach, where we do a symptom checklist approach, and that is how exactly, like these people have to fit into those boxes, otherwise no, you do not get those diagnoses, right? That is why a lot of misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis happens, or like overdiagnosis of like certain disorders, right? So those are the reasons why there can be like major gender disparity that exists, right? And recent trends, you should be aware, like what has been happening in schools is, see, when it comes to like diagnosing like neurodevelopmental disorders, you have to be very careful, right? Because what is happening, schools, especially with the rise of like private education, schools are very much concerned about like the performance of their school, and like performance of their students. So they want lesser students to fail, they want like lesser students to like they want like a higher passing percentage and things like that. So what schools are doing is they would want to get a LD certificate, and this is happening a lot with like learning disability certificates. So let's say you are working as a school counselor. See, sometimes you might not have the power to do this, because sometimes some school officials can be very, they adamant about getting that LD certificate, right? But ideally, you should know like how to go about these cases, right? Let's say a child is brought, you are working as a school counselor, and a child is brought to you, and the class teacher is like, okay, this kid is like very bad in studies, or whatever the traditional conventional definition of bad in studies means, right? Not bad student, not paying attention, probably has like some kind of learning disability. So we better like get him tested, and get the tell the parents to get the government certificate, which is sadly a lot of schools are doing, and certain hospitals are in on it. So that is the reality of things. But what you should do is, if like assessment, like I can't do like a very deep dive in it, but like when we say, we don't say testing, we say assessment, because testing, it could just be like using the tools, right? But when we say assessment, it's an entire process which includes the clinical interview, talking to the parents, talking to classmates, talking to teachers, right? Then assessing like the school record. Then you see ke, acha, from first standard to fifth standard the grades were decent, just in sixth standards the grades have dropped. What happened now? Is the child facing bullying? Is the child facing issues at home? Is the child having some physical disabilities that could be developing, which is like creating blocks in studying, right? A lot of different reasons. So you can't just be like, हाँ इन्होंने LD बोला है तो let's just test this. No, you have to do a proper assessment, talk to the child, give them that agency, right? And then see, okay, what kind of testing tools should I use, and then go ahead with it. So ideally, this is the approach you should take, and even for ADHD in the recent times, kids are not like allowed to be kids. This is one of the biggest um pediatrician. Yeah, we had this seminar, and he said, okay, there's this seminar on ADHD, and they're like, okay, in the recent trends, parents, because there's a change in like urban parenting, and so there's a lot of like okay, does this kid have ADHD? Then put them on like ADHD medication. But sometimes kids are just being kids. Sometimes some kids just might be more active, or might have a lot of, like in Hindi the word chanchal, things like that. So that doesn't mean that kid will have ADHD. Sometimes you need to let that, you see the kid's personality. Maybe the kids, once kids, some kids grow out of it, right? So again, you should be very careful with ADHD diagnosis in kids as well, especially with the rise in the whole ADHD medication, especially at the children's market. So, really do like a proper um, study of these things. Okay. Now moving ahead, we'll look at autism spectrum disorder. I just want you guys to like take 2 minutes and just this go through the kind of, I want you to see how DSM explains. This is of course not the exact, they have their own categorization A and B, but I've combined those things. So just quickly read, and can you tell me like what is this perception, or the theme of categorizing, or like the way they've mentioned the symptoms, if you can quickly do that. We just have 20 minutes, so yeah. Okay, till then I will read your messages. Exactly. If so many people are neurodivergent, is it really divergence? Exactly. So there was this one research in this discourse ki, there are more, like we anticipated. So there is data for American population where around, I think it was around 70 something percent people in America are neurotypical and the rest are neurodivergent, so that's the thing. And like if you're saying is so many people, so there's one thing about like neurodivergent folks is that they are usually magnets for other neurodivergent folks. So when you are if you find oh, most of my friends have ADHD or autism, or like those things, then it is more likely that you also might be on the spectrum, so that is a high possibility. So that's another thing why you might feel like, oh, there are so many neurodivergent people around, because like, oh, maybe that's a sign about something. So yeah, snowball sample effect. Yeah, that's one way to look at it. Yes. We are too fabulous. The neurotypical people were that is true. They are scared. They are scared. All the bullying is just projection of their inner insecurities. So yeah. Okay, can you guys tell me the theme of the language that DSM uses? Like these things, the way they have mentioned these symptoms. Do you guys have an opinion? It's okay. You can also not have an opinion, but if anyone has, caught on something, then you can share it. Yes, Shambhavi. It is deficit-based perspective model. It is a very medical model perspective where we are looking at what is wrong. It's a very clinical way of looking at it. So, which is like again, we need to shift from the medical model to the social model, right? So, yeah, very good, Shambhavi. So, let's try to understand, more from lived experiences. These are based on like case studies and real life examples. ठीक है, in daily routines, like so we have divided in three parts: daily living, social relationships, and at work, which are like overall covers most of our life domains. Yes, so in daily living, you might see that people with autistic folks, right, they might be very like very much routine or structure based. Changes can be very difficult, changes can be very scary, right? Like even like a small, like, oh, this is the route that I take to college. Let's say some, if there's road closure that happens, and then you have to take a different route. So if the person is autistic, and that is the route that they've been taking for the last 2 years, and now they have to take another route, a neurotypical person will be like, "Arey, another roadblock, like what is this government doing, blah blah blah." But for the autistic person, those things plus anxiety might happen, because that is a change in their routine, right? It's different from the structure that they follow, right? Which could cause to them having a meltdown, because now they have to, like their whole structure gets messed up, right? So there can take a lot of focus on routines, structured, fixed, like day to day schedules, right? Fixed food. There's this thing called as food palette, which basically means the kinds of, like, like if I say I have a small food palette, which means I don't eat a lot of things. I'm just open to eating very few things. When I say my food palette is pretty big, like I like trying new things, I'm open to eating anything and everything. That means my food palette is big, right? Usually autistic folks, their food palettes can be quite small, and they might not be, open to eating new food at all, right? Again, this is because of structure, because of familiarity is more comforting, and also because the food that they know, okay, or like, see, I see the way I'm using the language also, right? If I have to look at it from a very clinical perspective, I'll say, okay, food, very restricted food intake, right? Versus they have a small food palette, right? So on an individual level, this is what you can do to make the world more accessible, right? Sometimes it is difficult, like sometimes we might not be equipped with, an inclusive language, which is fine, but you should try your best. Yeah. Then they might have a small food palette, because now they've become like, now they know, okay, these are my safe foods. What does safe food mean? The texture is fine, the smell is fine, these things are not causing like sensitive, like, sensory overloads, and I'm okay with the texture of the food, I'm okay with the smell, I'm okay with the way it looks. You might see like some autistic folks might also have issues where with their foods touching, right? Again, that is like structure. Okay, this is supposed to be here, this is supposed to be here. So then, food touching in their plate can also be a problem, right? And upar se, let's say they were having like sensory overload, and even just seeing the foods touching each other can cause them to have a meltdown, and people will be like, actually, you're crying for this reason. But it might not just be that, it could be like they're already at a wedding, and there's so many people, bright lights, loud noises, and then their food on the plate is touching, and then that just like, then that makes them cry. So it's not just the food, it can be like a lot of things, because then people will try to infantilize, or try to be like, oh, you're so sensitive, or there's nothing wrong in being sensitive. But that is how people perceive these things, ke choti choti baaton pe you're crying. So it's not like trivial for you, it might be trivial, but you cannot decide how even so-called small thing can affect an individual, right? So, yeah. Then high functioning and low functioning. So, even in the DSM, you will see they have like levels mentioned, but in the recent times, especially coming from autistic folks and social justice communities, we tend to avoid high functioning and low functioning. See, sometimes if you're working in a hospital setting, if you're making certain like treatment management plans, we might not have better language, but a lot of most folks do tend to avoid high functioning and low functioning, because it becomes very ableist. What you can use instead of this is, like how much support, or how much compassion, or like everyone wants compassion, needs compassion, but like how much more support does this person need. And the thing is, again, with high functioning and low functioning, the problem with this is someone who might seem high functioning to the outside world, they just might be masking. And what will then happen, like when the high functioning, so-called high functioning individual, they are not being themselves, they are just putting on a mask, or they are following a script, a neurotypical script, so that they do not get discriminated, so that they don't get treated badly. And then that will, like all the resources of their brain and body will be used in masking, and that leads to an autistic burnout, right? What does an autistic burnout mean? So this can look like, a lot of times it can look like depression, right? They might become more non-verbal, they might not want to interact a lot, they might just want to sit in a dark room, they might not want to do the things that they like, eat properly. So this is very overlapping with depression, right? So then it can happen that a person is coming to you during an autistic burnout, and you will diagnose them with depression. So that is why it is very important to do like assessment, where you do like a proper history taking, case understanding, and then you understand, okay, what are their behaviors in other domains of their life. So that's why again autism can go like, not like misdiagnosis happens or underdiagnosis, and especially when it's women, depression and anxiety is, a more easily given diagnosis, then they will not like. And as we know in the medical field, there's a lot of medical gaslighting that women face, right? So that is with regards to physical illnesses, but as well as mental illnesses and disorders as well. So people or doctors just don't bother or care about taking a deeper look, and this is true not just for doctors but even for therapists and counselors, right? So autistic burnout very much looks like depression, but then you have to understand like what is the reason for it, so that can help you distinguish, is it depression or is it like an autistic burnout? Okay. Then autistic folks can have like special interests, like they might have, or like hyper fixations where, and these special interests can be literally anything. It doesn't have to be like, oh, trains, like one of the very famous examples, like, oh, autistic folks like trains, which is true, a lot of them do. And I think Big Bang Theory may, like there are certain like Sheldon Cooper, right? People associate him when you try to understand like popular characters. I think one good way of understanding like diverse folks of autistic, people on the autistic spectrum, if you guys watch the show on Hotstar, Elementary High. I'm forgetting the name, but it's basically Quinta. She started the show. So like there are different like characters which have like, there is, if you guys can do that homework and tell me which are these characters which do have different, like one character is very significantly the textbook definition of autism, but there is more than one autistic like character on that show, Elementary High. I will type the name out, but if you can watch it and if you can figure out on your own, that would be a nice exercise. Then yeah, so as I said, special interest can be anything. It can be concepts, it can like like certain theories or subjects. It can be people can also be special interest, like a lot of times people's romantic partners or their friends can become a special interest, right? But from a clinical perspective, DSM perspective, we would not consider it that, right? So that is another thing. Also, I want you to think a lot of times, especially with women, and then there's a whole another discourse also which I do not have the time to talk about, but it is a good practice when a woman is diagnosed with BPD, you should also give autism assessment, because a lot of things are overlapping. So you can, I also want you to think like, I know we've not studied, but I think you might be aware about borderline personality disorder, right? So, which also overlaps with a lot of ADHD and autism symptoms, right? So, the discourse I'll give you very briefly, I'll explain. The discourse is basically some people do not accept the diagnosis of BPD in general, so they will rather give, and with the new edition of DSM, we are going to see like, CPTSD and all of those things. So, let's see what they come up with. But then so there are certain professionals which rather follow PTSD or CPTSD plus ADHD and or autism rather than giving BPD, right? So again, that's a whole another discussion, but I want you guys to, when you are looking at these experiences or symptoms, see why it can be overlapping or why that discourse exists. Okay? So special interest can be people, same for like BPD, where they have like a favorite person ka concept. So that is what I mean. Then colors, there is like, I think you might have seen on Instagram this pink lady and green lady where their entire room, every single thing is based on that color only, or any, or that theme only, where every little thing in their house will be of that color, everything that they own or majority of the things that they own. So colors, activities like gardening or any other things. So special interest can be not just concepts but people, colors, or activities as well. Stimming we've already discussed. So stimming me usually, you'll think about, like we had the fidget spinner, right? That's a stim toy, right? Do you have like a lot of those pop it things, right? Those there are these circular popping things. That's a stim toy, right? So when we look at stimming, it's usually that, which is correct, but a lot of times some autistic folks can also use, which are considered like methods of self harm, like maybe banging their head, for example. That can be stimming. Why? Because it is a repetitive behavior done to calm themselves down. So again, like, are they doing it to harm themselves? Are they doing it to manipulate their family or romantic partner, or are they doing it to calm themselves? Right. So a lot of times, like, a lot of autistic people might have some dangerous stims as well. So you should, have that understanding as well. uh Uncomfortable. So again, this just my, me trying to be take a less clinical or a medical model approach, instead of using issues with eye contact, because who made the rule care you have to talk with this constant eye contact, right? Like, that in itself is very ableist, right? So like, them being uncomfortable with eye contact, they might struggle with that. A lot of them might train themselves. They know, or they've been, people might have pointed it out, okay, oh, you don't look at, this person, or you look down and talk. So so then they might train, because they're trying to mask as a neurotypical person, right? So SNES sometimes, so then eye contact can be very little, or sometimes they might not understand, okay, oh, is it too much eye contact that I'm doing? Like for neurotypicals, they might not think so much. They'll just look at the other person and do eye contact, but inside, like, internal monologue of a neurodivergent autistic person will be, am I making too much eye contact? Am I making too less eye contact? This much, I should, like, look at the person now. Or there can be, strategies that they use, like, okay, I should look at the forehead of the person, so that they think that I'm looking at their, like, looking like I'm maintaining eye contact. So things like that. Then we have listening to the same music for a prolonged period of time. So, like, a lot of autistic folks, just one song on repeat for weeks, can be months as well. This also means sometimes they might also certain noises or certain words, echolalia, where they repetition. So this is like following the theme of repetitive behavior, right? So they might say those words again, which again, like, does not have to be, can you tell me another disorder where there can be repetition of sounds or noises? There was a movie made about this disorder as well. I'm just checking the messages. Abbott Elementary, yes, that is the show. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Shambhavi. Yes, for giving that reference. And yeah, Tourette's, right? So then you have to see, okay, is it Tourette's, and Tourette's has like a neurological, like, cause for it as well, right? So that is different than this. Uh, yeah. Then watching, reading the same things over and over again, because again, familiar things are much better, right? Sensory sensitivities. So, like, the way they would like to live in their house, or just go about where it shouldn't be too bright, it shouldn't have, like, certain color preferences. Clothing may, like, rough clothes shouldn't be there. Certain textures can be, like, very irritating, can cause sensory overload. The food that they eat, the noises, the area that they live in, so those things can, like, shape their decisions, their major decisions in life. Alexithymia. So a lot of them, a lot of times, like, people, autistic folks might have a difficulty in understanding or identifying their own emotions. This can also mean, like, understanding certain pain that they might have in their body. Emotions, it's just not limited to just the emotions, but like other sensations, in their bodies as well. So not being able to understand, so they might feel it, it's just they're not able to understand ki, oh, this is happening to me. They might not be able to name it, but that does not mean that they are not feeling those things. Like, for example, in social context, when we say social cues is a difficulty for a lot of autistic folks, they might not understand that someone is being mean to them. They might feel bad, but they might not understand that, oh, why am I feeling bad? Or am I feeling bad? Or they just might be down and the other person will say, oh, you look low, what happened? So those are the experiences. Then let's look at yeah, any doubts till here? I'm just relating with symptoms. Oh, okay, that's a very funny way to put it. And if you are relating to symptoms, I hope you find like good community. And if you wish to go ahead with an official diagnosis, you can do that as well. Yeah, let's look at like social relationships, how autism shows up in social relationships. So again, see, it's a spectrum, and the way one person experiences it can be very different than the other, right? So there can be usual trends are ke most of their life they might not have as many friends, or they might have struggled making friends. Forget maintaining friends, even making friends could be a difficulty. And a lot of times they might not have a problem with that, but their families might be like, oh, this, like, you can't be friendless, you can't be this way, right? So those things as well. These people are the ones who can be seen as being too introverted. If you guys have given, there is this test about left brain and right brain, which is again pop psychology. But people who do have, like, again usme bhi certain things, you can just look at that and be like, oh, these are more like signs of like autism. Again, if you look at right brain, more technical and things like that, that also fits into autism, right? And left brain as well, where they, those quizzes would have questions like, do you like does the tag of your shirt irritate you? Do certain materials feel nicer to wear? Do you avoid wearing certain types of material? Then left brain. But then that's just like sensory issues, right? So you should like go through those questions as well and see how those are actually like a diagnosis for like autism kind of a thing. Just that intensity matters. There can be neurotypical folks or like neurodivergent folks who might not have the disorder level ka experiences, but so like, yeah, do go through that. Yeah. Then there can be people who might have big groups of friends, because again, why this? Because they are following a script. So thing with autism is there is a script that I have to follow, so that I am usually the reason for following the script is, or usually the reason for masking is also, so that I am not discriminated because I am perceived differently. you know so that is the thing, like, they'll feel like, oh, having big group of friends is the norm, is what I should be doing. So they will try to fit in, they will abandon their authentic self, and but despite having a big group of friends, they might actually lack depth or quality. They might not have any actual best friend who understands them, who they can share things with, who they can be themselves with, right? So they might have big group of friends, and this can especially be seen more with women, because there are certain like pleasantries expected from women versus men. Like, you might see it might be relatively easier. I'm not saying it's always easy, but relatively, like boys, they might be relatively more okay with being just alone and not making a lot of friends. And you'll see the same doesn't apply to a lot of girls, even though they might be autistic as well. Again, the way male friendships and female friendships work, again that also has an influence on this, so we can't just go with the typical understanding, okay, oh, this person is autistic, then social and communication issues are there, so then how can this person have many friends? You have to look at, like, you have to have a very nuanced perspective. Everything is not just, say, black and white, and you can't just put people in boxes that way. Can't People are not checklists, no. So you have to look at, like, nuance, then you have to look at their gender, you have to look at which community are they coming from, an individual, like a western perspective, or like are they coming from a collectivist. So you can understand ki someone who is raised in Asian countries coming from more collectivistic mindsets, even if they might not feel, they will try and go in a big group and try to help them, and then that's how people become friends. So again, that is also important, like the culture context of, how that has an effect on social conditioning. So there's no one way to be autistic, or one way to have ADHD. Then difficulty in understanding social cues. So this can be non-verbal cues as well as verbal cues. So like jokes, sarcasm, mean behavior, fights. They might, like with their partners. Like the partner is upset, but the autistic person is not able to understand. And then later they realize, they look at the pattern. So like autistic folks are very good at, a lot of autistic folks are very good at, like, pattern recognition. So because of that, they might understand. Okay, wait, this is this. Wait, are you mad at me? So though then baad, after 2 days, they're like, wait, are we fighting? Is this a fight? So social cues is not just limited to sarcasm or jokes. It can also be like not understanding when someone is being mean to them, someone is targeting them, someone, or like, you are having fights with your friends or your partners. So yeah, those things as well. Then some autistic folks might come off as very, so my class started thoda late, so we are still following my 1 hour ka time. It's 8:05. We'll just take some more 10-15 minutes. Yeah. So some autistic folks might come off as very rude and blunt, because they do not might not understand ki, oh, why do I have to sugarcoat certain things. They might not mean it in a malicious manner, but it just, they might not see, like, a lot of autistic folks might not understand the reason for small talk, or like the fake formal pleasantries that you do. They might not engage in that because they don't see the reason, because a lot of them do focus from a very logic perspective. So it's not coming from being malicious or being mean, but it's more from, like, what's the logic behind, like, I don't understand, like, what's the use of this, or maybe they just like say it how it is. For some people can be perceived as too technical or robotic. One of my clients who does have ADHD and autism, he said it like, sometimes people use, oh, this person talks like a robot and very monotonous. Some people use it in a derogatory manner, but for some folks, like one of my clients, he actually explains his experience as, he feels better that he can relate to a robot. So he doesn't see it in a mean way. So again, we cannot keep having these boxes. Ki, oh, this person like robot can not always be a derogatory thing. It can also be like, maybe this person relates to this concept and feels better, or understands themselves better. Again, then next thing, like, they can be too expressive because they might not understand the social norms of how much I should be or how I should be sharing. Or sometimes they can be hardly any like no expression, facial expressions, or giving very one word answers, very minimal verbal information. So they can be on both ends. Now, like, women, recent research has shown women, autistic women are more vulnerable to sexual trauma, because again, this understanding cues does not happen, right? So that leads to them being relatively more vulnerable to being at the receiving end of sexual trauma. Now, then there can be hyper or hypo empathy, where they can feel, like, they hyper empathy. What it means is, they might like empathize with their friends, with their family. If they're going through a problem, then they might start getting nervous for the other person, right? That can be hyper empathy, where someone else is going through a problem, Okay, good doctor. I haven't watched that show. But yeah, thank you for sharing. So, so if they can, when we say hyper empathy, again, see, these are very uh can be ableist, because like what is the baseline of empathy? Who decides ki how much empathy is okay or not, right? But one way to understand is ki once the empathy starts affecting you a lot, let's say someone has a lot of like hyper, is more likely to have hyper empathy. If a family member is going through some illness, then they'll start feeling so empathetic that they might start experiencing those symptoms which might not actually might be happening in their bodies. So that is the level of hyper empathy that can happen for certain folks. And hypo empathy where they might not understand okay, what that person might be feeling. But again, this does not mean, so what a lot of neurodivergent people sadly end up doing is they use their neurodivergence as a shield to be horrible people, and they'll be like, oh, but I don't have empathy. But then if we go back, if as psychologists or as students of psychology, we have learned empathy as a skill and not as an inherent quality. So that is one thing where we can tell them कि no, ऐसे नहीं है कि inherently, see, some people, even for when we do like personality disorders, even for antisocial personality disorders, they might not feel empathy, but that does not mean that they cannot cognitively think that, okay, I have seen this pattern, that if you do this, then that will hurt the person. So they might be feeling bad. I don't feel bad for them, but, or like, not that I don't feel bad for them or I cannot understand it, but I know that this causes hurt. So I should not do it. So a lot of people might tend to use this hyper empathy or not understanding social cues as a shield to be horrible people, but that does not make it valid. In women, sometimes like they can, so this is like, how certain markers of understanding that this could mean this. So sometimes when, again, why too feminine, like again, there are like relationship dynamics, especially in queer relationships. I know queer is, some folks do consider it as a slur because it used to be, but for the lack of better words, like especially in like queer couple dynamics, right? There are these gender identities, right? So even through that you can understand कि if this person, ऐसे नहीं है कि only too feminine, it can be like masculine people can also be, but just like it's more than, it can also be a special interest being or like practicing femininity, right? So that can also be why they are like a high femme person, things like that. Now, this BPD PTSD thing we've already discussed, where like women might get like diagnosis of this, so you should consider doing like an autism assessment as well. Social conditioning for women affects how they will manifest, how the symptoms or signs or experiences of autism will manifest in them, the amount of masking that they will do, that will, the social conditioning has a big effect. I think some of you might have watched that video on Instagram where they give a bunch of young boys this thing to drink, which has like a lot of salt or something like that, and then they give the same thing to girls, and the boys immediately are very honest and they say oh no, this tastes bad. But then the girls, like they, despite them having the same thing, they say no, it's not bad. So then social conditioning, where how, what you expect out of girls and women and the way we raise them has a big effect, big effect on these things as well. uh Okay, it's 8:12. Yeah. So then we have the double empathy problem. What this means basically is that, it's not just neurodivergent people, but also neurotypicals might have a misunderstanding or might have gaps in communication, which is not because, like social skills are not there. Like autistic people do not have social skills or lack of social understanding. No, it is because neurodivergent people have different perspectives, different reasoning, and neurotypicals might have a different reasoning. And both of them are not able to understand each other's perspectives. So then that double empathy problem where neither of them are able to empathize with the other person, right? So here the important part to understand is that it is not because they do not have social skills, right, which is the basic understanding of autism, where you lack social and communication skills, right? That is how we learn about autism. But it's just that it's not that they lack, it's just that they express differently. That doesn't mean that that is a wrong way to express. Then these people, autistic folks, they can experience, like they can be, perceived by others as being too sensitive, you know. So where like acha, like even the smallest things hurt you, they might start crying and things like that. So people do bully kids and adults for being too sensitive, but there's nothing wrong in being that. But when you see a person who is very sensitive, it could mean okay, maybe this person could be on the spectrum. And then of course you look at like other things as well. Have to follow a script, yeah, this we already discussed. They can be more vulnerable to bullying. So there was this I think it was a Tumblr post where, or a tweet where, like we need to study how, 7, 8-year-old kids are better at detecting autism than professionals, because professionals do misdiagnose and underdiagnose. But, you can see, like kids are very easily able to understand, oh, who is following the neurotypical script and who isn't. The shyest, quietest kids, usually the most introverted kids, tend to get bullied more. So like if your client has a history of bullying throughout, or like major incidences of bullying, you should try to look into, okay, why were they getting bullied? Were they being perceived as weird? Were they being perceived as too sensitive, too weak, things like that? Then it could mean that they could be on the spectrum. Then relatively more interested in kinks, because we are doing social relationships. So even in like romantic or sexual relationships. So again, correlation is not causation, right? It's just a research where they found out that there was a high correlation, like people who are neurodivergent, not just autistic folks but neurodivergent folks in general, are into more like kinks, or like kinks with regards to like sexual activities, right? So again, correlation is not causation. Just because someone is autistic does not mean that they will naturally be inclined towards it, but relatively more interested. Also again, same goes for this, where a lot of autistic folks do have, like because they do not fit into the binary, or they don't experience gender or sexual orientation or attraction the way like allistic folks might experience. So like a lot of autistic folks, you'll find that they are also queer, they might also be trans. So again, correlation, not causation. Then we have the rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is basically, like if they, again, this is, as you can see, perceived. So like if I am perceiving, okay, this person might be rejecting me, or maybe they are criticizing me, or I have failed to do my task, and my teacher or my partner, they're not happy with, or I have not fulfilled their expectation, then they might start feeling intense emotional pain to that situation. They might feel a lot of anxiety, shame, guilt, things like that. So that is rejection sensitivity, where it's not the person is getting rejected in the material reality of things, but they perceive it to be, they can be a little more harsh on themselves, right? So that could be another reason for that. Then non-verbal, they might not, some autistic folks might be a little more non-verbal, where they might not talk so much. Like you might have seen certain family members also, like they might not have an official diagnosis of autism, but they still, the autism doesn't go away, like a certificate doesn't decide that, right? So like certain family members, they're always like very quiet, they only speak very few words, right? Then they have their own special interests, which we might have not seen it from that perspective, right? So that, and then we have to also see is talking the only way to communicate, right? Like if you have a person who is non-verbal, maybe they don't want to talk through speech, verbal communication. So what can be done? Oh, do you want to text me? right? Do you want to write it on the paper, right? Like as a teacher, what I do is like in class, I don't force anyone to answer my questions. And I also give them different ways of answering, where, like you can ask your friend to answer it for you. You can write it in a chit. You can come to the board and write your answer. You don't have to always express it verbally. That is how you make a more inclusive, accessible world, right? So we have to be like, okay, non again, we are not looking at autism matlab, lack of social and communication skills, right? Maybe they just don't feel like, like it's okay. Some people just don't want to talk that much. And like there is no reason to put a hierarchy in the way we express our emotions, or whatever we want to communicate to the other person. So the reason that it's very able is not just for autistic people, but even people who might have a speech or hearing impairment, you know or someone who might be, let's say, insecure about their voice, right? Let's say a man, if he ends up having like a feminine voice, people might have bullied him for that. And then then he might not want to speak up or like talk a lot, right? So again, when we try to be more inclusive of neurodivergent or disabled people in general, we are being inclusive of everyone. That's why like the universal design that is there in the disability studies and all of those things, right? So non-verbal behavior. Then one second, I wanted to add recognition. Yes. So at work, how can autism show up like at work? First we look at the problems that they can face, not because they are autistic, because the world is not built for everyone. So like typical office setups, like corporate setups, very bright lights, very crowded offices, right? So these things will lead to autistic folks having a sense like meltdown, sensory overload, right? That might affect their efficiency to do work. So what can be the answer, and what a lot of corporates around the world are trying to adapt is they are trying to have quiet rooms where the lighting there is more dimmer. It's more quieter. They are providing disability aids, like for autistic folks. There are these noise cancelling headphones that are there. You can use those as well. One way, if I don't know if you guys are aware about this, but a lot of years ago, Big Bazaar used to have like this Wednesdays. Again, it's not entirely accessible because they just did one day in the week, that to middle of the week. Like, so you're assuming okay, autistic people are unemployed, but yeah, but at least that was a good try. So we shouldn't like invalidate their efforts of being inclusive. So on Wednesdays they would have like dim lights in the Big Bazaar ka area. They would have like very soft music. Otherwise there's very in these grocery stores, supermarkets and malls, they have like very loud music playing, right? They would have like dim lights, soft music, and the staff, like lesser staff, so that there's less crowd, but they'll be at every point to help them. So that was one good attempt at being inclusive. So similarly, like in office setup, there are like organizations who are trying to be inclusive, right? Then autistic folks might get targeted easily. Yeah, I just need like 5 more minutes. Is that okay? Yeah. Oh, okay, okay, okay. Just 5 minutes and done. Yeah. So yes. So you can have like your clients, if they come to you and they just talk about like, oh, at work, I'm getting targeted a lot. Then you can try to find out reasons for that. So I'm just saying, okay, your clients will not come to you saying, okay, I have autism. You have to look at like, so why we're discussing these things in detail. You have to look at, okay, oh, this person is experiencing this. What could be the possible reasons of these things, right? So yeah, so they could get like targeted easily because again, the same kind of bullying that they might have experienced in school and colleges, that can again follow them in their office settings as well, right? They might miss on like work networking, because they might not want to hang out like post work hours and hang out with their group. They might not see reason in it, or they just might not feel comfortable, so they might miss out on those things. And a lot of times, like certain work environments, they do make certain decisions or discussions, or have certain connections post work meet hours maybe. So they go out for drinks or dinner, things like that, so they might miss out on those things. They might not understand office politics, because they are just there to get their work done, and like all those understanding, like the ulterior motive, underlying meaning of things being said, sarcasm, things like that. So then they might struggle with those things as well. Social cues issues can be here. They might not be able to be diplomatic, which is again something which is very necessary in a lot of corporate settings, so that can be a problem. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria here, when with regards to their tasks that are there, or like their relationship with their colleagues, things like that. Let's also look at like the good things that autistic people can bring to the table in work settings. Retention rates is usually, autistic folks might not leave their jobs, because again, like they do, if they like what they're doing, the pay is good, and then they do like to follow structure and rules, and changes are difficult, so they might decide to stay a little bit longer, right? They bring their unique problem solving skills, right? The way they perceive things is different, so even looking at a problem differently can give you a different solution, right? They are usually more detail oriented, so a lot of jobs do require those things, which neurotypical people might lack. They can focus for longer periods of time, and they'll be good at, like a lot of autistic folks are good at pattern recognition. So this can be come in handy as a therapist, as as a coder in coding language, things like that. So these are the like it's not just like negative but also positive things that they bring to the table. So yeah, that was about it. Does anyone have any doubts? Okay, I am assuming there are no doubts. All right, thank you guys. I think someone raised their hand. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I will see you guys in the next class. And yeah, bye. Yeah, thank you, Sanjana. Sorry it went a little extra. Yeah. Okay. I will just leave. Yeah.
Hello, hello. Can you guys see me? Can you hear me? Hello. Yes. Happy to see you too. Actually, I can't see you. And I know you've had two very long sessions. Um, so I'm not